While she was still Princess of Wales, still living in Kensington Palace, still attending state dinners with the Queen, Diana was secretly recording hours of testimony about her marriage, her treatment, and the royal family's behavior. She smuggled the tapes out of the palace. She gave them to a journalist. And when the book those tapes became was published, it detonated a bomb inside the monarchy that is still going off 30 years later. Most people know that, or they think they do. They've heard the quotes recycled in 100 documentaries, read excerpts in 1,000 articles. 3 of us in this marriage: the bulimia, the self-harm, the coldness. But here's what almost nobody stops to consider: how those words got out. Not the content of the tapes, the operation behind them. Because what Diana did in the autumn of 1991 wasn't just brave or reckless or desperate. It was, by any reasonable definition, an act of covert intelligence. A woman trapped inside a hostile institution, manufacturing evidence of her own imprisonment, and smuggling it past the guards in the hands of a friend on a bicycle. This is that story. Not the marriage, not the divorce, the operation. Start with the walls. By late 1991, apartments 8 and 9 at Kensington Palace had become something closer to a gilded surveillance post than a home. Diana was 30 years old, a decade into her marriage to the Prince of Wales, mother of 2 heirs to the throne. And she had come to believe, with very good reason, that the institution surrounding her was actively monitoring her movements, her communications, and her contact with the outside world. She wasn't wrong. Within months, the Squidgygate scandal would prove it in the most humiliating way possible. A deeply private phone conversation between Diana and her close friend James Gilby, possibly recorded as early as 1989 off an analog mobile signal, was published by the tabloid press in August 1992. Every intimate detail, every whispered word, splashed across front pages for millions of strangers to read. Whether that intercept came from amateur radio hobbyists or something more deliberate has never been definitively settled. Doesn't matter. The effect on Diana was the same. She told friends she believed her lines were tapped. She feared the palace itself might be bugged. And the phone taps were just one layer. Royal protection officers from the Metropolitan Police were stationed at the palace. Visitors entering the grounds were logged at the gate. Diana's personal staff, dresser, butler, private secretary, existed within an ecosystem that ultimately answered not to her, but to the broader royal household machinery, controlled from Buckingham Palace by the Queen's own private secretary. Diana would later describe, both on the Morton tapes and in her 1995 Panorama interview, the suffocating sensation of being surrounded by people whose loyalty ran to the crown, not to her. She suspected household staff of reporting her activities back to Charles's office, back to Buckingham Palace, back to the firm. So picture the operational environment. A woman living inside a controlled compound, her phone calls intercepted, her visitors logged, her staff potentially compromised, her complaints dismissed as hysteria by the very people she's complaining about. She can't hold a press conference. She can't sit for an interview. She can't even have a private phone call without worrying someone's listening. The unwritten rules of the institution are absolute. Royals do not air private grievances. The palace communications apparatus exists to project unity, stability, and silence. Diana had no sanctioned way to tell her own story, so she built an unsanctioned one. The handler was Andrew Morton. By 1991, Morton was an experienced royal correspondent, well-connected, competent, but not yet a household name. He understood the royal press ecosystem inside and out. The lobby briefings, the careful management from Buckingham Palace press officers, the implicit rules governing what you could and couldn't report. He also understood that, behind the palace's curated facade, the Wales marriage was disintegrating, and the real story was one no journalist had managed to get on the record. But he couldn't just phone Diana up and ask. He needed a cutout. Someone who could reach the princess privately, outside official channels, someone whose presence at Kensington Palace wouldn't trigger a single alarm. Enter Dr. James Colthurst. Colthurst was a surgeon, an old Etonian. He'd known Diana since the late 1970s, back when she was still Lady Diana Spencer, barely out of her teens. He wasn't a journalist, wasn't a palace insider, wasn't anyone the royal household had reason to watch. He was simply an old friend paying a social call. That was his cover. And it was perfect. Here's how the system worked. Morton would compose detailed lists of written questions, carefully structured prompts about specific periods of Diana's life, specific incidents, specific people. He'd hand these questions to Colthurst. Colthurst would then cycle, actually pedal his bicycle, across London to Kensington Palace, the questions tucked into his bag. He'd enter through normal visitor channels, sit with Diana, hand over Morton's questions, leave. Then Diana was alone. Behind closed doors in her sitting room, she'd take out a tape recorder, a standard cassette player, nothing sophisticated, nothing that would look unusual sitting on a table, and she'd press record. She'd work through Morton's questions one by one, speaking her answers into the microphone in a room where no one could hear her. No Morton present, no Colthurst present, just Diana, her voice, and a small machine capturing every word. Morton himself later said the setup was much simpler than people imagined. Nothing James Bond about it, just a woman, a tape recorder, and a briefcase to carry the evidence in and out. Once Diana finished a batch of recordings, the courier returned. Colthurst would cycle back to the palace, collect the finished cassettes during another friendly visit, slip them into his bag, and pedal them across West London straight to Morton's door. Pause on that image for a second. A doctor on a bicycle, pedaling through the streets of West London, carrying audio cassettes in his bag that contained the most explosive royal testimony of the 20th century. No encrypted files, no burner phones, no anonymous servers. A man on a bike, tapes in a briefcase. The dead drop was a bicycle basket, and it worked. For months, from autumn 1991 into early 1992, the system operated without a single breach. Nobody in the royal household flagged Colthurst's visits. Nobody searched his bag on the way out. Nobody noticed the cassette player. The palace's security apparatus, built to protect royals from outside threats, had no protocol whatsoever for a princess who was the threat. A woman building the case against her own captors and walking the evidence out the front door through a friend. 7 hours. That's how much Diana recorded across those months of sessions. 7 hours of first-person testimony that would become the most devastating account ever produced about the modern British monarchy. And devastating is the right word, because Diana wasn't trading in vague unhappiness. She was naming names, citing incidents, providing dates, describing scenes with the precision of a witness giving sworn evidence. On Charles and Camilla, her testimony was forensic. She described knowing about the relationship before her own wedding. She recounted finding a gold bracelet Charles had commissioned for Camilla shortly before the ceremony, engraved with the letters G and F, for Gladys and Fred, the private pet names Charles and Camilla used for each other, drawn from characters in the BBC radio comedy The Goon Show. She described the honeymoon aboard the royal yacht Britannia as a period of profound loneliness. Photographs of Camilla falling out of Charles's diary, Charles wearing cufflinks engraved with intertwined C's, a token linking him to another woman during what was supposed to be the most intimate weeks of his new marriage. These weren't tabloid rumors. These were eyewitness accounts from the bride. And then Diana went further, deeper, into territory no royal had ever made public before. She spoke about her bulimia in raw, unflinching terms. how it started within weeks of the engagement. The compulsive eating, the purging, the relentless cycle that was both a response to the emotional vacuum of her marriage and a scream for help that the palace refused to hear. She described episodes of self-harm with near clinical precision, cutting herself with razor blades, with a lemon slicer, with a penknife. She recounted throwing herself down a flight of stairs at Sandringham while pregnant with Prince William, landing in a heap at the bottom while the Queen looked on in horror and Charles dismissed it as attention-seeking. 5 suicide attempts. That's what she described. Each one a signal flare fired inside a palace that had collectively agreed to see nothing. "When no one listens to you," Diana said on the tapes, "or you feel no one's listening to you, all sorts of things start to happen." She even recorded the moment Prince Harry was born, in September 1984. Charles's first words upon seeing his second son, according to Diana, were an expression of disappointment, not at having a healthy child, but at having a boy rather than a girl, and a red-haired one at that. Every single one of these details was a choice. Diana selected them, recorded them, placed them on tape, knowing they'd be published. She was a woman building a documentary case, and every word was ammunition aimed at the same target, the official palace version of a happy royal family that she knew, from the inside, to be a lie. But an operation is only as good as its cover story, and Morton's was brilliant. The plan was simple. Morton would publicly claim the book was based on interviews with Diana's close friends and associates, people who knew her intimately and had agreed to speak on the record. Diana would publicly deny any direct involvement. She'd even say she'd never met Andrew Morton, which was technically true. The whole point of the Coulter system was that Diana and Morton never needed to be in the same room. The friends, Carolyn Bartholomew, James Gilby, and others, did cooperate, some at Diana's direct request. They provided corroboration, context, color. But the friends were the scaffolding. Diana's tapes were the building. And the cover story held that the scaffolding was all there was. Classic tradecraft. Plausible deniability for the asset. The handler takes the heat. The first detonation came on June 7, 1992, when the Sunday Times began serializing the book. Not a tabloid. The Sunday Times, Murdoch-owned but editorially prestigious, the broadsheet of the British establishment. That choice of outlet was itself a tactical decision, lending the revelations a credibility no red top could have provided. The effect was seismic. Each weekly installment hit like a separate blast. The first, covering Diana's bulimia and self-harm, provoked something close to a national convulsion. Within days, the full book, published by Michael O'Mara Books, went straight to the top of the bestseller lists. It would eventually sell millions of copies worldwide, translated into dozens of languages, becoming one of the best-selling nonfiction books of the 20th century. Before Morton's book, the public narrative of the Wales marriage was one of mutual difficulty. Two people who'd grown apart, fault distributed vaguely and evenly. After the book, there was a villain and a victim. Charles was the cold, unfaithful husband. The institution was the callous machine that had crushed a young woman's mental health to protect its image. And Diana was the silenced princess who'd finally found a way to speak. Her version replaced the palace's version. It has never been displaced. Buckingham Palace was blindsided. Their press operation, built around managed briefings, controlled access, and the implicit threat of exclusion from the royal beat, had absolutely no playbook for a breach from within. There were murmurs about seeking an injunction to halt the Sunday Times serialization, but no injunction was ever filed. The palace almost certainly understood that trying to suppress the book would only amplify its claims and confirm them in the public mind. So the official line became studied silence. The palace would not dignify unauthorized publications with a response. Behind the scenes, fury. The counterintelligence response unfolded not as a single dramatic confrontation, but as a slow, grinding realization. The book's level of detail, those cufflinks, that bracelet, the stairs at Sandringham, was too specific, too intimate to have come from friends alone. Senior figures in the royal household began to suspect what they couldn't quite prove. Diana was the source. She had to be. Prince Philip wrote Diana a series of letters after the book's publication. Letters that have been variously described as stern, blunt, and punishing. The exact contents have never been fully published, but their tone has been characterized by multiple sources as deeply critical. Philip reportedly challenged Diana's account, questioned her behavior, and expressed the royal family's collective displeasure at what they viewed as a betrayal of the institution's most fundamental covenant: silence. Diana's isolation within the palace deepened. Whatever thin pretense of normalcy had survived the marriage now evaporated entirely. By December 1992, Prime Minister John Major stood up in the House of Commons and announced the formal separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales. The Queen, in a speech that November, described 1992 as her annus horribilis, her horrible year. The Morton book was the single largest reason why, but the cover story held. That's the remarkable thing. For 5 full years, the official position remained that Diana had not directly participated in the creation of the book. Morton maintained the fiction. Diana maintained the fiction. The palace suspected, but couldn't prove it. It wasn't until 1997, after Diana's death in Paris, that Morton published a revised edition titled Diana, Her True Story, in her own words. And that's when he revealed everything. The tapes, the questions, Colthurst, the bicycle, the whole operation laid bare. And here's what makes this story matter beyond gossip, beyond royal intrigue, beyond the tabloid metabolism that consumed it. Diana's operation created a template. She proved that a member of the royal family could go directly to the public, over the institution's head, and win. That template didn't die with her. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle sat down with Oprah Winfrey in March 2021 and described racism within the institution, the isolation, the institutional indifference, they were following a path Diana had carved 30 years earlier. She showed that the palace's greatest vulnerability wasn't external, it was internal. A member of the family with first-hand knowledge, willing to speak. The Morton tapes also gave Diana the confidence, or perhaps the operational experience, to go even further. 3 years after the book, she sat down with Martin Bashir for the Panorama interview and delivered on camera some of the most famous words ever spoken about the monarchy. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. That line didn't come from nowhere. It was the distilled essence of 7 hours of cassette tape, refined and sharpened over years of telling her own story in secret before she ever told it in public. 30 years later, those tapes remain the single most important primary source in modern royal history. Scholars cite them. Historians build on them. Every documentary, every book, every dramatization of the Wales marriage ultimately traces back to a woman alone in her sitting room at Kensington Palace, speaking into a recorder, answering questions she'd never be allowed to answer in public. She couldn't escape the palace, so she smuggled the truth out instead. Cassette by cassette, bicycle ride by bicycle ride, through the hands of an old friend and into the pages of a book that blew the doors off the most powerful family in Britain. Diana didn't wait for someone to rescue her story. She pressed record. She answered the questions. She handed the tapes to a man on a bicycle. And she let the truth do the rest. Subscribe for more stories like this.